The German soldier crouches in the ruins of the royal palace at 0400 hours on February 11th, 1945. SS Hauptsturmführer Gerhard Schmiedhuber has not slept in 36 hours. Around him, what remains of the Budapest garrison prepares for the breakout attempt that represents their last chance at survival. 28,000 men, German and Hungarian, will try to escape through Soviet lines that have surrounded the city for 51 days. They have ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of fighting. They have no artillery support. They have no air cover. They have no reserves. What they have is desperation and the knowledge that surrender means Soviet captivity, which for many means death. In 16 hours, the breakout will begin. In 24 hours, fewer than 700 men will reach German lines 40 miles away. The rest will be dead or captured, ending the longest and most destructive urban battle on the Eastern Front, a siege that killed 38,000 German and Hungarian soldiers, 80,000 Soviet troops, and at least 38,000 civilians in a city that Hitler had declared a fortress and Stalin had sworn to take regardless of cost. Budapest mattered because Hungary mattered. Hungary had been Germany's reluctant ally since 1940, providing troops for the Eastern Front and allowing German forces transit rights. But by late 1944, the alliance was fracturing. Soviet forces had driven into Romania and were approaching Hungary's eastern border. Hungarian Regent Miklós Horthy, recognizing Germany's inevitable defeat, began secret negotiations for an armistice with the Soviet Union. Hitler learned of these negotiations in October 1944 and responded with characteristic brutality. On October 15, 1944, German forces executed Operation Panzerfaust. SS commandos kidnapped Horthy's son, holding him hostage to force the region's cooperation. German tanks surrounded government buildings in Budapest. Wehrmacht units disarmed Hungarian army formations. Within 24 hours, Horthy had been removed from power and replaced by Ferenc Szalasi, leader of the Arrow Cross Party, Hungary's fascist movement. Szalasi pledged continued loyalty to Germany and total war against the Soviet advance. The coup secured Hungary's allegiance, but could not secure its territory. Soviet forces were already crossing the eastern frontier in strength. The Second Ukrainian Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky and the Third Ukrainian Front under Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin comprised over 1 million men, supported by 1,700 tanks and over 1,300 aircraft. Their objective: destroy German forces in Hungary, capture Budapest, and advance to Vienna. German and Hungarian forces numbered approximately 500,000 troops organized into Army Group South under General Hans Friesner. The disparity was clear, outnumbered 2-1, without air superiority, defending territory where local support was collapsing. Standard doctrine called for mobile defense, trading space for time, preserving forces for eventual counteroffensive. Hitler rejected this doctrine. Budapest would be held. Hungary's oil fields at Nagy Kanizsa would be defended. Retreat was forbidden. Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Budapest on November 3, 1944. The city sprawled across both banks of the Danube, connected by 7 bridges. Buda occupied the western bank, built on hills and dominated by the royal palace and citadel fortress. Pest, on the eastern bank, was flat, dense, and industrial. Total population? Approximately 800,000 civilians, now swollen to over 1 million with refugees from eastern Hungary. The garrison defending Budapest numbered approximately 79,000 troops. German forces included elements of the Feldherrenhalle Panzergrenadier Division, the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, the 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division Maria Theresa, and various Wehrmacht security and support units. Hungarian forces consisted of the 1st Armored Division and several infantry divisions of questionable reliability. The commander was SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch, an officer with experience in defensive operations but no illusions about the strategic situation. Pfeffer Wildenbruch requested permission to withdraw before encirclement was complete. Hitler refused. Budapest was designated a Festung, a fortress city to be held regardless of circumstance. Garrisons in fortress cities fought to the last man or faced courts martial for cowardice. The policy had already destroyed German forces at Stalingrad, Breslau, and Königsberg. It would destroy the Budapest garrison as well. Soviet forces completed the encirclement on December 26, 1944. The last road connection to German-held territory was severed. The garrison was trapped with limited supplies. minimal ammunition reserves, and no prospect of relief. Pfeffer Wildenbruch organized his forces into defensive sectors. German SS troops held the most critical positions. Wehrmacht units covered secondary sectors. Hungarian forces, whose loyalty was questionable, were assigned rear area security. The siege began with Soviet artillery bombardment. Over 1,000 guns, ranging from 76mm field pieces to 203mm howitzers, pounded German positions 24 hours a day. The heaviest weapons fired shells weighing over 200 pounds that could collapse entire buildings. Katyusha rocket launchers, the Stalin organs, added their distinctive shriek to the bombardment. 16 rails mounted on truck chassis, each firing a 132mm rocket with a 47-pound warhead. Accuracy was poor, but the psychological effect was devastating. German positions in Pest absorbed the worst of the bombardment. The flat terrain offered no natural cover. Buildings collapsed under sustained fire, creating rubble fields that channeled movement and favored defenders with machine guns and Panzerfausts. Soviet infantry attacked in waves, supported by T-34 tanks, the workhorses of the Red Army. The T-34 weighed 32 tons, mounted an 85mm gun, and had armor up to 90mm thick. German defenders countered with Panzerfausts, man-portable anti-tank weapons with shaped charge warheads capable of penetrating 140mm of armor. Effective range, 30 meters, close enough to see the tank commander's face. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Soviet troops advanced building by building, floor by floor, room by room. German defenders held each position until flanked or out of ammunition, then fell back to the next prepared position. The front line became a three-dimensional maze where control of a building's ground floor meant nothing if the enemy held the upper stories. Snipers operated from rubble piles. Machine gun teams barricaded stairwells. Assault groups with grenades and submachine guns cleared cellars. Casualties mounted horrifically. Soviet rifle divisions, typically numbering 6,000 to 8,000 men, lost 50 to 70% strength in the first 2 weeks of fighting. German losses were proportionally similar, but unlike the Soviets, they received no replacements. Every casualty weakened the defense. Every death shortened the perimeter. By January 10, 1945, Soviet forces controlled most of Pest. German defenders had retreated across the Danube into Buda, demolishing 4 of the 7 bridges to slow Soviet pursuit. The remaining bridges, the Sechenyi Chain Bridge and the Margaret Bridge, became contested terrain. Soviet engineers attempted to secure them intact. German demolition teams tried to destroy them. The Chain Bridge, Budapest's iconic suspension bridge, was finally blown on January 18th, its massive stone pylons collapsing into the Danube. The defense of Buda became Germany's last stand in Budapest. The terrain favored defense: steep hills, stone buildings, narrow streets. The Royal Palace, Castle Hill, and Gellert Hill formed natural strongpoints. German forces established defensive lines using the city's medieval fortifications, supplemented with modern obstacles, tank traps, minefields, barbed wire. Artillery positions on Castle Hill could fire down onto Soviet forces in Pest, interdicting river crossings and supply routes. Soviet forces adapted their tactics. Direct assaults against prepared positions were too costly. Instead, they employed siege warfare. Surround each strongpoint, cut off reinforcement and resupply, reduce resistance through artillery and starvation. The tactic was methodical and brutal. German positions that held out were bypassed and isolated. Those that retreated found themselves compressed into ever smaller areas with ever fewer supplies. Food became critical. The garrison had entered the siege with 30 days of rations. By mid-January, supplies were exhausted. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers ate rats, stray dogs, anything with calories. The civilian population faced worse conditions. Soviet artillery deliberately targeted food distribution centers. The Arrow Cross government, more interested in hunting Jews than feeding citizens, provided no organized relief. Starvation deaths became routine. Medical care collapsed. Hospitals were destroyed by artillery. Medical supplies ran out. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. Wounded soldiers and civilians died from infections that antibiotics could have prevented. The Gellert Hotel, converted to a military hospital, held over 3,000 wounded by late January. Conditions were medieval. Men lying in corridors. Surgery performed by candlelight. The dead stacked in basements because burial was impossible. Hitler ordered relief attempts. Between January 1st and January 26th, 1945, German forces launched 3 major counteroffensives attempting to break through to Budapest. Operation Conrad Wing 2 and 3 committed over 30,000 troops and hundreds of tanks. The attacks gained ground initially, advancing to within 15 miles of Budapest's outskirts. But Soviet defenses held. Counterattacks drove German forces back. The relief attempts failed, costing thousands of casualties and destroying German mobile reserves needed for the defense of Vienna. By early February, the garrison situation was hopeless. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Artillery had been reduced to firing 20 rounds per gun per day. The perimeter had contracted to a few square miles centered on Castle Hill. Over 50,000 soldiers and civilians were compressed into this shrinking pocket. Sanitation was non-existent. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia killed hundreds daily. Pfeffer Wildenbruch requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused and ordered continued resistance. On February 8th, Pfeffer Wildenbruch made the decision to attempt a breakout without authorization. The plan was desperate. Assemble every mobile soldier. Abandon the wounded and most heavy equipment. Attack westward through Soviet lines. And reach German positions near Lake Balaton 40 miles away. Success required surprise, speed, and luck. The garrison had little of the first two and none of the third. The breakout began at 2300 hours on February 11th. 28,000 men formed into assault columns. The lead elements were SS troops, combat veterans who understood their only chance was violence and momentum. Behind them came Wehrmacht units, Hungarian soldiers, and stragglers from destroyed formations. They moved on foot through darkness, navigating by compass, avoiding roads where Soviet forces waited. The first German columns achieved tactical surprise, overwhelming Soviet positions through speed and desperation. They captured the suburb of Budapest by 0200 hours on February 12th, temporarily opening an escape corridor. But surprise lasted only hours. Soviet forces reacted, repositioning units to block escape routes, calling in artillery on suspected German assembly areas. By 0600 hours, the breakout had fragmented into dozens of small groups fighting independent battles across miles of terrain. Most groups were destroyed within hours. Soviet tanks hunted German columns on open ground. Artillery caught troops crossing fields and valleys. Machine gun positions blocked routes through villages. The wounded were abandoned. Soldiers who could not keep the pace were left behind. The breakout became a massacre. Desperate men hunted through frozen countryside by an enemy that gave no quarter. Small groups continued fighting for days. Some reached German lines. Most did not. Of the 28,000 men who attempted the breakout, fewer than 700 reached safety. Approximately 16,000 were killed. The remainder, over 11,000 men, were captured. Pfeffer Wildenbruch was among the prisoners. He survived Soviet captivity and was released in 1955. Soviet forces occupied the last German positions in Buda on February 13th. The siege had lasted 102 days. The city was destroyed. 70% of buildings were damaged or demolished. All bridges across the Danube were down. Infrastructure, water, electricity, gas, transportation had ceased functioning. The royal palace was a burned shell. The parliament building was gutted. Thousands of corpses lay unburied in streets and ruins. The casualty accounting was imprecise but staggering. German and Hungarian military casualties, approximately 38,000 killed, 62,000 captured. Soviet military casualties, approximately 80,000 killed and wounded. Civilian casualties, at least 38,000 dead, though the true figure may have been much higher. Thousands more died in subsequent months from disease, starvation, and exposure. The Arrow Cross regime had used the siege to intensify persecution of Budapest's Jewish population. Over 100,000 Jews remained in the city, confined to a ghetto in Pest's 7th district. Arrow Cross militia murdered thousands, often marching victims to the Danube and shooting them so their bodies would fall into the river. Others were deported to concentration camps. Soviet forces liberated the ghetto on January 18, 1945. But the liberation came too late for tens of thousands who had already been killed. The strategic consequences of the siege were minimal. Budapest's fall did not fundamentally alter the course of the war. Germany was already defeated. The question was when, not if. The Red Army continued its advance into Austria, regardless of Budapest's resistance. But strategically minimal does not mean meaningless. The siege tied down Soviet forces for 3 months, forces that might have advanced further west, possibly reaching Vienna or even Bavaria before Western Allied forces. The delay gave thousands of German civilians time to flee westward, escaping Soviet occupation. From Hitler's perspective, the siege served its purpose. Budapest held longer than Stalingrad had, becoming propaganda for Germany's continued resistance. The fact that the defense was ultimately futile was irrelevant to Nazi ideology, which valued sacrifice over survival. Every day Budapest held was presented as proof of German determination. That this determination killed tens of thousands and accomplished nothing strategic was beside the point. The tactical lessons were familiar to anyone who had studied urban warfare. Defenders with prepared positions could inflict severe casualties on attackers even when outnumbered and outgunned. But defense without prospect of relief or resupply was suicide. The Budapest garrison's destruction was inevitable from the moment encirclement was complete. Continued resistance served no military purpose, only political symbolism. Soviet tactics in Budapest demonstrated both the Red Army's strengths and weaknesses. The artillery bombardment was overwhelming but indiscriminate, destroying military and civilian targets equally. Infantry tactics relied on mass and attrition rather than finesse. Soviet commanders accepted horrific casualties to maintain offensive momentum, a calculus that would have been unsustainable for Western armies, but was standard for the Red Army throughout the war. The human cost extended beyond those who died in combat. Tens of thousands of civilians were caught in crossfire, killed by artillery, or died from starvation and disease. Soviet occupation brought new horrors: mass rapes, arbitrary executions, deportations to labor camps in Siberia. Hungarian soldiers who had fought for Germany faced summary execution or decades in Soviet captivity. German prisoners of war were transported east, many dying en route. Survivors spending years in camps where mortality exceeded 50%. The city itself took decades to recover. Reconstruction of Budapest's bridges did not complete until the 1960s. The royal palace remained a ruin until the 1970s. Entire neighborhoods destroyed in the siege were simply bulldozed and rebuilt with Soviet-era architecture. The scars of the siege remained visible into the 21st century. Bullet-pocked buildings, preserved ruins as memorials, unexploded ordnance discovered during construction projects. Post-war narratives about the siege diverged sharply. Soviet historiography portrayed the battle as heroic liberation of Hungary from fascist occupation, minimizing Soviet casualties and ignoring atrocities committed during and after the siege. Hungarian communist authorities echoed this narrative, celebrating Soviet heroes while suppressing accounts of Hungarian resistance. German accounts focused on military aspects, emphasizing the garrison's determination and Soviet brutality, while avoiding discussion of why the defense was ordered in the first place. Western historians initially treated Budapest as a footnote to larger campaigns, another city destroyed in the final months of war. Only in recent decades has the siege received proper scholarly attention. Researchers accessing Soviet archives discovered the extent of Red Army casualties, far higher than previously acknowledged. Hungarian historians documented civilian suffering and arrow cross atrocities. German military records revealed the desperation of relief attempts and the hopelessness recognized by commanders even as Hitler ordered continued resistance. The survivors carried memories that could not be reconciled with official narratives. German veterans remembered fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, their sacrifice squandered by leadership that valued symbolism over soldiers' lives. Soviet veterans remembered comrades lost in brutal street fighting, urban combat that made the worst days of Stalingrad seem tolerable. Hungarian civilians remembered a siege where both sides were enemies, where German defenders prevented surrender and Soviet liberators brought new oppression. The breakout on February 11th became the siege's defining image. Desperate men attempting escape through frozen darkness, most dying within hours. The survivors forever marked by what they had witnessed. Post-war interrogations of survivors revealed the psychological toll. Many described the breakout as relief, even when they knew death was likely, because it meant action after months of passive endurance. The choice between dying in ruins or dying attempting escape was not really a choice, but it gave men agency in circumstances that had stripped away all control. The weapons used in Budapest were unremarkable: standard rifles. machine guns, mortars, artillery. The T-34 tanks were reliable but unexceptional. German Panzerfausts were effective but single-shot. Soviet Katyusha rockets were psychologically terrifying but militarily imprecise. The siege was not decided by technological superiority or tactical innovation, but by arithmetic and will. The Soviets had more men, more ammunition, more time. The Germans had excellent defensive positions and determined troops. In siege warfare, numbers eventually prevail over courage. The civilian population's experience has been documented through memoirs, diaries, and oral histories. Families sheltered in cellars for months, emerging only to search for food or water. Children grew up knowing only siege conditions, the sound of artillery as background noise, corpses in streets as normal, hunger as constant companion. Elderly residents starved to death in apartments, their bodies discovered weeks later. Mothers made impossible choices about which children to feed when rations ran out. The Arrow Cross militia used the siege to pursue ideological goals. While soldiers fought and civilians starved, militia units hunted Jews, political opponents, and anyone suspected of insufficient loyalty. Summary executions occurred daily. Bodies were left in streets as warnings. The atrocities continued until Soviet forces physically occupied the ghetto. Though Soviet occupation brought different but equally severe dangers for those who survived. The Danube became a mass grave. Thousands of bodies, military and civilian, ended up in the river. Some were victims of Arrow Cross massacres. Others were casualties of combat near the riverbanks. Still others were soldiers who drowned attempting to cross during the breakout. The river carried bodies downstream for months after the siege ended, depositing them on banks where they became grim reminders of what the city had endured. The fortress doctrine that mandated Budapest's defense was Hitler's creation. Born from his refusal to accept strategic reality, every fortress city was ordered to fight to destruction. Stalingrad, Budapest, Breslau, Königsberg. The defenders knew the orders were suicidal. They followed them anyway, sometimes from discipline, sometimes from fear of consequences for their families if they surrendered, sometimes because they believed Germany's new wonder weapons would still change the war's outcome. None of these justifications altered the futility of their sacrifice. Soviet forces did not treat the siege as victory. They treated it as necessary but costly progress toward Berlin. The casualties were acceptable because they occurred while advancing, maintaining offensive momentum, destroying German combat power. That the garrison might have surrendered if Hitler had allowed it was irrelevant to Soviet planning. If Germans chose to fight to death, Soviet forces would accommodate them. The calculus was brutal and entirely consistent with how the Red Army approached the entire Eastern Front campaign. At 0400 hours on February 11th, 1945, SS Hauptsturmführer Gerhard Schmidhuber prepared for the breakout that represented his last chance. He survived the attempt, reached German lines, and continued fighting until war's end. He survived Soviet captivity and returned to Germany in 1949. He never spoke publicly about Budapest, joining thousands of other veterans who carried memories too painful for words. The Siege of Budapest stands as testament to the futility of ideology divorced from strategic sense. The city's defense accomplished nothing except its own destruction. The garrison's sacrifice bought neither time nor strategic advantage. The civilian population suffered horrors that served no military purpose. The siege was Stalingrad repeated with foreknowledge of Stalingrad's outcome, proving that institutional learning means nothing when leadership refuses to learn. 102 days, 38,000 German and Hungarian dead, 80,000 Soviet casualties, at least 38,000 civilians killed, an ancient city reduced to ruins. And when it ended, the Red Army continued advancing westward as if Budapest had never existed. Its fall changing nothing except the lives it destroyed and the memories it created in those who survived.